Welcome to the Haunted Grove podcast, where we discuss anything and everything spooky and paranormal. I am Megan, your host, and boy, tonight, do I have a spooky story for you. This has got to be one of the craziest alien UFO encounter stories that I have ever heard. In September of 1964, Don Shrum was 26 years old. He lived with his wife Judy and their one-year-old daughter in Orangeville, California, which is a suburb of Sacramento. Don lived a fairly average blue-collar life. He had a great job as a welder, and he worked for a company called Aerojet General, which had contracts with the US government to design and build parts for different types of missiles and rockets. So he had a good job. It was a stressful job, but it was a good job. And just to be clear, Don did not work for the military. He worked for a company that worked for the military. Don was also an outdoorsy kind of guy, and he loved to spend a lot of his free time outdoors doing things like hunting and camping and fishing, and he really just had a love for being out in nature. So that September, Don and two of his buddies from work, Vincent Alvarez and Tim Trueblood, decided to have a guys' weekend and go on an overnight deer hunting trip to this secluded area that they knew a couple hours away in the Tahoe National Forest, which is in the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Northern California. It was too early in the hunting season for firearms, so they were going to be taking their bows and arrows. And Don was a very experienced bow hunter, and he actually preferred it over hunting with firearms, so he was not upset about this at all. So when the day came for the trio to leave, they excitedly packed up their car, said goodbye to their families, and then started the several-hour drive up through the Sierra Nevada mountains and into the Tahoe National Forest. And as they were driving along this narrow two-lane highway, they were looking for a very particular spot where they could pull their car over just off the highway and then hike to the edge of this canyon where they would be setting up their base camp. So after driving for what felt like forever, they eventually find the spot to pull their car over. And the three men get out of their car, load up all their gear, and then they start the 3-mile hike to this canyon where they're going to be hunting deer. And when the men finally get to their destination, the sun is starting to come down, and they had just enough time to get their campsite set up before they needed to get out and start hunting. Their plan was to split up and walk in different directions around this fairly large canyon. Don was going to walk around the ridgeline at the top, while Vincent and Tim were going to descend into the canyon. And their goal was for Don to drive down any deer that he encountered into the canyon towards his friends. And this was the 60s, so they didn't have cell phones, and they didn't bring along any radios or like walkie-talkies or anything. So their plan to stay in communication was they were just going to stay within shouting distance of each other. So Vincent and Tim start making their way down into the canyon, and Don starts his long trek around the ridgeline. And as Don is walking through this thick brush and maneuvering around trees and large boulders, he's also keeping his eye out for any signs of potential animals around him. It was getting darker, and he definitely did not want to be surprised by any predators or dangerous critters lurking about in the shadows. And after about 20 or 30 minutes of trudging through this thick vegetation and trying not to fall on his and keeping his eye out for bears and whatnot, it suddenly kind of pops into Don's head that he can't hear or see his friends anymore. So he starts to shout for them, but they're not answering. And it's at this point that Don starts to panic a little bit. He's realizing that he must have gotten turned around at some point, maybe when he was maneuvering around the trees, and he must have wandered off the path a little bit, because now he's looking around and he's not 100% sure where he is anymore, and he has no clue where Vincent and Tim are. So after taking a couple of deep breaths, Don spends some time assessing his situation. He is not happy with it, but he's also not overly concerned, right? He's an experienced outdoorsman and a hunter, so he knows that the worst case scenario is he's just gonna have to spend the night alone. And this is ultimately the conclusion that he comes to. It's getting really late, it's very dark, and he definitely doesn't want to make the situation any worse by getting himself even more lost. So ultimately, he decides he's just gonna wait until morning when he can see where he's going and make his way back to camp without a deer and with a somewhat battered ego, right? Because he got himself lost. So he decides to stay put and wait until morning. But, it's nighttime. There's predators in the area, like bears and mountain lions. So he's decided he's going to spend the night up in a tree and stay off the ground. Now, he knows that bears and mountain lions can climb trees, right? But it just gives him that extra bit of space or that split second he may need to draw his bow and shoot. Because he knows he's not actually going to be sleeping in that tree. He just wants the added protection. So after looking around for a bit, he finds this large pine tree with the first of its branches being about 12 feet off the ground. The tree's on the edge of the ridge, and it's kind of overlooking the canyon, and there are these 3 large boulders that are a few feet from the base of the tree, and the tallest one of those boulders is about 4 feet. So Don is able to get up onto this 4-foot boulder, right? And he jumps up and he grabs onto the branch and kind of shimmies his way over to the tree and pulls himself up. And he's feeling pretty good about this. He's making the best out of this not ideal situation, right? So he's settling in, and he's got his full hunting outfit on, right? So he's warm and he's totally camouflaged. He has his bow in his lap, and he's just ready for a a long night of waiting and listening, just in case his friends are out there searching for him and yelling. He wants to be able to hear them. So a couple hours into his waiting, Don is up on his tree branch, just kind of scanning the area, the horizon line, and when he sees off in the distance this small light moving through the tree line on the other side of the canyon. And it was kind of like bobbing and weaving and not really moving very fast. And as he's sitting there watching it, it kind of hits him all of a sudden. Oh my God, it's a helicopter. Vincent and Tim must have gotten a hold of park rangers and they're out looking for him. And he's super excited. Yay, I'm going to be saved. So he jumps down from the tree and reaches into his pocket to grab out one of several matchbooks that he always kept on him. And he lights these 3 small signal fires on each of these boulders because he wants to get their attention, but it's not a life or death situation, so he doesn't want to go crazy with the fires either. So he lights these fires and he's just watching the helicopter move back and forth, kind of scanning the area until finally it spots him and it starts moving in his direction. And he is so relieved. They found him and he can just go home, hanging his head a little bit, a little embarrassed, but they found him. He doesn't have to spend the night out there. Except after a couple moments, he notices that he can't hear anything. Helicopters are loud and you can hear them from miles away, especially in an area like this. He knows something is really wrong, but he is somewhat in denial. So he stands there and just kind of watches this light slowly get closer to him until finally his fight or flight instincts kick in. And he's like, this is wrong. This is not a helicopter. He snuffs out the fires as quickly as he can, and then he jumps back into the tree, gets himself back into his spot where he's well hidden from whatever this thing was that was coming towards him. And as he's just sitting there, silently watching this thing come towards him, the light is getting bigger, but he notices that the light itself is actually a small light, and it's like a headlight that's attached to this huge cigar-shaped craft. And he couldn't see it until it got closer because it was so dark, but this huge ship was about 150 feet long and had these 3 rectangular windows or panels that were on the side, kind of like doors. And as this huge ship got closer to him, but it was still a good distance away, he could see that this smaller ship came out of one of those square panels that was on the side of it, and it started to kind of make its way to the ground, still in line of what he was calling the mothership or the big ship, but it just kind of hovered there, and then it made its way to the ground. And after a few minutes of intently watching this mothership, he's squinting around trying to see where this smaller little ship landed. And as he's looking around, he can start to hear these noises in the brush, like someone's walking towards him. And then it starts to sound like there's several people making their way through this dense brush towards him, and it gets louder and louder as they get closer and closer. And eventually, what looks like 4 or 5 small humanoid things make their way out of the brush and start surveying the area around these large boulders at the base of the tree that Don was in. And Don is freaked out, obviously, but he's trying to be as still as possible, and he is just hoping that his camouflage and the branches of this tree are just enough to keep him hidden from these things. He said they looked human. They were small, probably about 5 feet tall, and they looked like they were wearing some kind of white suit and some kind of a helmet. However, their face was exposed. Don could see that they had these huge black eyes, and in fact, he said it looked like they were wearing welding goggles, but their noses were flat and they were much further down on their face than a human nose would normally be. And as he's watching these creatures, he sees 2 of them picking around and taking samples from the ground, the leaves and the soil, and just studying the plants. And then he sees the other 2 walking over towards him, towards the base of the tree, and then they just stare up at him. And he knows instantly that they can see him, but they just stand there and stare at him while making these cooing or hooting noises. Don described it as sounding like owls, and every so often they would look back in the direction of the mothership and then back up at him. It was almost like they were waiting for directions on what to do. And after an agonizingly long time of watching these beings communicate, or what he assumed was communicate, with the mothership, Don hears more rustling coming towards him from the direction of that smaller ship. And then out of the brush steps this crazy robot looking thing. Don describes it as the same rough size and shape as the other beings, except it was not organic in its movements at all. It was very stiff and, robotic. But he also said that this thing's eyes were glowing reddish orange and its jaw was just square and mechanical looking. And it became obvious to Don that this robot thing was summoned to come help these other beings in some way. So when it walked over to the base of the tree along these other 2 beings, they were kind of cooing and hooting back and forth until finally this robot looks up at Don and then raises its hand up to its jaw and then activates something. And all of a sudden, this white smoke or mist came spraying out of its mouth in Don's direction. The white mist floats up to Don, and he immediately starts choking and gasping for breath, and then he blacks out. When he wakes back up, he's slumped forward over his bow, but he's still in the tree. And it couldn't have been that long that he was out. He was thinking maybe just a couple of seconds. But as he comes to, he's still gasping and dry heaving, but he's like, nope, this. And as quickly as he can, he scrambles up another couple of branches to be higher off the ground and further away from these things. And Don is wearing this like a military utility belt. So he actually takes his belt off and then uses it to secure himself to this branch so he doesn't fall off. Because he knows that if he hadn't fallen forward onto his bow, he would have fallen out of that tree. So after he is secure in place, he takes his bow, he loads an arrow, and he just fires it right into the chest of this robot. The arrow hits the robot dead in the middle of the chest and then like ricochets off with sparks flying everywhere. And it actually knocks the thing back a few feet. And Don can tell that none of these things were expecting that at all. But he wasn't sure if this was going to be enough to scare them off. But after just a few moments, the robot and these other two creature things start making their way back to the base of the tree, and the robot starts to reach for its jaw again. So Don quickly loads another arrow and then just launches it at this thing again, hitting him dead in the center of the chest again, and resulting in the same outcome. Except when this thing stumbles back, Don quickly loads another arrow and fires again, hitting him in the exact same spot of the chest again. So he can see that it's starting to work. They're starting to back off. So he reaches for another arrow, but he's out. That was his last one. And he's really panicked now, and he just starts throwing shit at these creatures. He's literally everything. He's throwing his bow, he threw his canteen, he threw a handful of change at them. He didn't care. Whatever it was he had on him that he could throw, he was throwing at these things. And as he's rifling through his pockets just throwing things, he finds one of the matchbooks, and just out of necessity at this point, or whatever he doesn't know, he just takes off his hat and he lights it on fire and he just throws it down at him, which ended up having a slight effect. It moved them back a bit, like they were almost scared. And that is all that he needed. He's now lighting whatever he can on fire and throwing it down at this thing. He's literally lighting everything on fire. He burned his socks, he burned his jacket, he lit his boots on fire, anything. And in addition to trying to scare these things off, he was also trying to light the surrounding shrubs on fire, because he thought in his mind if he could just keep them away and start a large enough fire, the rangers would see it and they would come rescue him. And in between all of this, he's still getting gassed by this robot, right? Like this white mist is still coming and hitting him, and it happens 2 or 3 more times. And finally, when he's down to just his white undershirt and his pants with little bits torn off him that he tried to light those on fire, he runs out of matches. And he's just thinking, oh my God, I don't have anything left to fend these things off with, and they don't seem to be in any hurry to get out of here. And at one point, it looked like these 2 little humanoid things were actually trying to figure out how to climb the tree so they could get up to him. But every time they got close to a branch, he would like shake the whole tree and spook them away, and then they would back off. And this went on all night. And eventually, Don was like, I'm gonna die. Like, he started to accept the fact that he couldn't keep this up much longer. It had been all night, and he knew it had been all night because he could start seeing the pinks and purples of the sun coming up on the horizon line. And just as he looks down from looking up at the sunrise, he gets hit in the face with this damn mist again and blacks out. And when he woke up this time, he was actually dangling from his belt, the one that he attached to the branch, and he was off the tree. He hasn't fallen, but he is dangling off the tree. And even though he is exhausted and freezing because he's half naked, he gets a burst of adrenaline and just pulls himself back up to safety. And when he looks around, the creatures are gone. He can't see him anymore. But he continues to wait for the sun to come up just to be extra sure that they were gone and they weren't like hiding in the bushes waiting for him to come down. But eventually he is certain that they are gone. And then he cautiously gets down out of the tree and he starts to survey the area, and he can see where they had been. He could see all these little footprints everywhere, but in the footprints there were no tread in them. So there were these tiny little feet, but whatever shoes or boots or whatever they were wearing, there was no tread. And then of course he sees all the shit that he threw at them, all the charred remains of the stuff. So he goes to grab his bow, he grabs his canteen, and he actually manages to find 2 of the arrows that he fired at the robot, and then he takes them back to camp. He does find his friends, Vincent and Tim, back at camp, and then he tells them what happened. And Vincent told him that while he was out looking for Don, he saw what looked like a meteor or a shooting star over in that direction, and he remembers saying to himself, man, I didn't think that they moved that slow. And then Tim had said, well, yeah, maybe he saw something, but he wasn't really sure. So the 3 of them have a very awkward and silent car ride home, and when Don does get home, he tells his wife what happened, but he's really reluctant to tell anybody else. He does not want anybody to know about this. So Don and his wife do end up telling her parents about it, but otherwise they are not interested in letting anyone else know what happened. Don was really worried that he was going to lose his job or that he would just be ridiculed by his friends and family. But as it turns out, his family was very supportive. They all said, they knew this guy and he's not a liar. This is not something he would make up. So Don's father-in-law, who was in the Air Force for 30 years and had just recently retired from a nearby Air Force base, he calls up one of his friends and he asks him, he's like, hey, did you guys have any training missions last night, or was anything going on in the area that you could tell me about? And his friend was like, no, we didn't have any training missions, and really there was nothing going on last night. And really, they just wanted to see if there was some way that they could justify what happened, right? They heard Don's story and they're like, maybe it was something natural that happened. So Don's mother-in-law calls her old astronomy professor at the city college and talks to him about what happened. She just wanted to know if there was anything natural that went on that night that could explain it, or if anyone else had reported seeing lights in the sky. While Don really was not interested in talking to any media about this, he did want somebody of authority to know what happened, just in case there was some kind of public safety issue. So the professor says, I can help, and he takes down Don's statement and then he sends it to the Air Force base nearby. And after only a few days, they heard back. There was 2 high-ranking Air Force personnel from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio that wanted to come talk to Don. Now, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is where the Air Force studies UFO encounters and claims, so it was curious that they wanted to come out and talk to him. But after just a few weeks, Don and his wife went to meet with these 2 high-ranking Air Force officials at a random unoccupied home on the military base nearby. So it was in military housing. They sat down at this kitchen table and Don was asked to tell them what happened. And they recorded the whole thing on one of those like old school, huge reel-to-reel recorders that you used to see in like police interrogation movies. And Don was 100% cooperative with these men. He was just like, man, this super scary thing happened. I don't want this to happen to anybody else. If I can help in any way, I want to. So he told them everything. He drew them maps to where their camp was, to where the tree was that he was in, where he saw the mothership hovering, and even where he saw the small ship land. And he even brought one of the arrows that still had little bits of metal on it from where it hit the robot. And the conversation was going really well. Don felt really good about it. These men were really nice. They showed Don and his wife the equipment that they were using to record, and they were like, oh yeah, we'll give you a copy of the recording so you have one as well. And by the way, we want to take that arrowhead and analyze it, but we're going to send it right back to you. And you can probably guess what happened. Towards the end of the interview, things changed. The 2 men started to change their tone and they became very sarcastic and accusatory. They were like, well, were you guys just out there drunk? And are you sure you saw what you saw? And then they started blaming things like maybe it was teenagers trying to pull a prank. And Don was like, dude, I unloaded 3 arrows into the chest of one of these things. It was not a human teenager. And then they started to try to make up stories like, well, maybe it was the Japanese. Remember, this was the 60s. Maybe it was the Japanese. So they were secretly plotting something and you stumbled upon their plot. And Don was just like, are you serious? And he left there feeling really defeated. They were like making fun of him at the end. They're not taking him seriously. And ultimately, they would end the investigation with the determination that this was all psychological. It was all in Don's head. Nothing really happened. He was just crazy and he made the whole thing up. So he was upset and he was mad and he was frustrated and he started to feel really depressed. And a few weeks later, to try to help put things into perspective, he goes back out to the site where it happened and back out to the tree. And he brings with him his brother and 2 other friends. And Don's really just kind of looking for some closure. He does actually feel crazy right now. But when they get out to this place, they can see that it has been picked clean. There was no trace of anything left. The burnt pieces of clothes, the footprints, the burned shrubs, nothing. In fact, whoever was there went as far as to rake up the debris in a 50-foot radius from the base of the tree because they could see the rake marks still in the ground. And while he was super pissed, it actually made Don feel better. They believed him. They had to have believed him, enough at least to go back out there and clean it all up. But Don and his wife, they would never hear back from the Air Force. They would never receive the copy of the recording, and they never got the arrowhead back. And this whole incident really messed with Don for the rest of his life. He had terrible nightmares for years afterwards. His wife would say that he would wake up in the middle of the night just screaming, those eyes, those eyes. And every time he heard an owl, it would freak him out. And he ended up with this buzzing noise that only he could hear. And every time he would hear it, he would see something in the sky, or he would feel the need or compelled to look into the sky every time he would hear this buzzing noise. And he did end up losing his job, although he is not certain it was because because of this. There was a whole group of people that lost their job, but within that group was Don, Vincent, and Tim. Remember, they didn't work for the government, but the company did. Don and his family ended up having to move to another city, and it made life really hard for him. He did eventually talk to a few people about the incident, but he always wanted to make sure that his name was never mentioned when the story was told. He wanted the story out there for people to know what happened, but he did not want his name associated with it at all. He became obsessed with aliens and UFOs and would attend gatherings for groups like MUFON, or the Mutual UFO Network, which had a lot of highly educated professional people associated with it. And it wasn't until 2007, and Don was in his late 70s, when he contacted Torres and Ruben Uriarte, who were two authors, and he met them at one of these MUFON meetings. And he said that they could write a book about his story because he wanted to keep it alive for people to know what happened to him 43 years earlier on that September night. And they did write that book. It's called Aliens in the Forest, the Cisco Grove UFO Encounter. So what do you guys think happened? Do you think Don really battled aliens in the forest for 12 hours and lived to tell the tale? Or do you think he made it all up for some reason? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and give it a like, and go ahead and subscribe if you want to see what wanders into the Haunted Grove next week.